Hi everyone, and welcome back to another lecture in our course. Today, there we go. Today, as the title of the presentation implies, we're going to be talking a little bit more about micro-sociology. But before we jump into it, I just wanted to gently remind all of you that your first quiz for the course is going to be next Friday, June 12th. I'll have some more specific information about what exactly the format of the quiz will be, and you're going to be able to find that in our Files tab under the Assignments folder. I'll have a description of how exactly the layout of the quiz is going to look and some study suggestions for you all as well. What I will say right now, though, that I replied to someone, I can't remember which one of you it was, in our discussion, and someone asked, are they going to be open book exams? And the short answer is yes, right? I can't monitor or proctor you guys while you take this. So my assumption is that you have access to your notes, right? And you can use them and there's no way of me knowing. However, I will say the way that I have always designed my exams is that they're not easily answered by your notes. Okay, so there's going to be very few questions that, for example, ask you to just provide me a 1 or 2 sentence definition of some concept. You're more likely to encounter questions that ask you to identify examples of a concept, or maybe even provide examples of concepts yourself, or to make an argument based on some statement I've given you using the frameworks and theories we've learned in here. So I do recommend that you study like you normally would for any exam, right? And that you don't just rely on having access to your notes, because one, your notes will only be as helpful as this sentence doesn't make sense of where I'm going on. Your notes might be helpful to reference, but they will not be nearly as helpful as you having actually learned and internalized the material and actually having a deep understanding of it. The other thing I'll say is that if you rely heavily on your notes to provide answers for you, you're likely to run out of time on the quiz between going back and looking at your notes and actually taking the test itself. So if you're planning on not studying, just relying on your notes, I would say maybe rethink that a little bit, because in order to be successful, you actually do need to have an understanding of the material yourself. Okay, so all of that being said, more specific information on the quiz will be on our Canvas site. And of course, I'm always happy to answer questions and review with you guys in office hours, and you're always able to reach me over email. Okay, so let's talk about micro-sociology for today. So as a quick review, we've talked about these different levels of analysis that we can have and use in our sociological research, right? Ranging from this macro, zoomed out perspective to the micro, zoomed in. Just as a quick review, when we're talking about macro sociology, we're looking at large groups, right? Probably whole populations. We're looking at institutions, maybe differences between nations, sort of big picture stuff. When we move down to the meso level, then we're starting to talk about interactions between groups of people, right? And then all the way at the micro, we have the smallest units of society, right? That is individual people. And through that, we can think about the self, socialization, which we're going to talk about today. So we're obviously today starting with micro. In our next class, we're going to be talking about more of the macro, right? How do we as sociologists study these large groups, organizations, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's talk about some of the goals for this class today and the questions we're going to be asking. Of course, straight to the point, we're going to look at what is micro-sociology exactly, okay? And then more specifically, we're going to be looking at subtopics within micro-sociology. So we're going to ask, how do we develop a sense of self, a sense of identity as human beings, okay? We're going to talk about what socialization is and why it's important to us as sociologists. And then we're going to look at some theoretical perspectives sociologists have used to study microsociology, specifically a kind of theoretical tradition called symbolic interactionism. All right, so if you're a psych major, some of these questions might actually sound a little familiar to you. They might even sound kind of like a social psych perspective. And this is, as I've said in the past, kind of a gray area between psychology and sociology, where they start to blend a little bit. But we're going to ask all of these questions and always go back to society at large, right? So how do we understand the self in the context of the whole of society, how people are socialized, how does society impact us there? So we're always going to be moving back and forth between these micro units and then society at large to make it a little bit more sociological. Okay, and then sort of the big picture question that I hope you'll all have the tools to grapple with by the end of this is this question of, do each of us have an inner self that is distinctly and uniquely our own? Okay, so it's that inner being that we feel like is distinctly and personally ours. Okay, so if you want, you might even pause the video here for a moment and reflect on that for yourself a little bit. Sort of what is your perspective on this question? And then we're going to move on and try and tackle it ourselves using sociological tools. All right, so this is going to be part one of the lecture, obviously, and in this part we're going to be focused on the self as a sociological concept and how society plays a role in building that self. All right, so here we're going to start with this concept of socialization. Okay, when we think about how we come to be human beings, right? How we develop personalities and a place in the world. Okay, we always have to think about the role society plays in that, right? So we might ask, how does society influence our identity and sense of self? Okay, in essence, what social forces are at work in shaping us as human beings and members of society that maybe we have no control over? Okay, so what hand does society have there? So we know that we are products of our social environment as human beings, right? Because from the moment we're born, we're constantly encountering influential social forces that kind of shape us, give us a personality, that shape our perspectives on the social world, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And this happens through a process that we call socialization. Some of you might be familiar with this, specifically, for all of you psych people, again, this is probably a familiar term. Socialization is a process that we all have to go through, and it's through this process that we acquire the values, the norms, and the ideologies of a society, right? So it's essentially where we learn how to be good human beings, and specifically how we become good human beings in our particular society. Okay, so as Americans, we might go through a particular socialization versus Europeans, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to list all the nations of the world here. But we learn how to be a human being in the context of our own society, and we'll actually, we'll nuance this a little bit more as well as we go on. So this process of socialization begins in childhood. It actually begins from the moment we're born and we start interacting with other human beings, right? That initial socialization in childhood is referred to as primary socialization. Okay, and this is again that first act of socialization wherein we learn the values and the actions that are appropriate to members of our culture and our society. Okay, so for example, elementary school teachers teach students to raise their hands to go to the bathroom or to answer a question, right, and to say please and thank you. Through guiding children like this, we're teaching them basic etiquette, right, and what we value as a society, order, respecting authority, et cetera, et cetera. We might also think of your parents enforcing a bedtime, right, or you learning through your parents what it means to be a mom and what it means to be a dad, and also what's expected for you as a fellow human being and a member of that society. Okay. But socialization carries on throughout our lives, right? That period of primary socialization is particularly important because we're fresh in the world, right? And we know nothing about our society. The truck going by, you can probably hear. But socialization continues throughout our lives as we interact with these social forces and the people around us, and we learn more about our society and our place in it. Okay, so this process of secondary socialization happens when we're a little bit older. We've already gone through primary socialization. We know sort of the basics of society, what's expected from us, what the shared norms and values are in our society, and how to be a good member of that society, right? We know to hold doors open for people, to say please and thank you, to not stand too close to people when we're talking, that we should value education and getting married one day, et cetera, et cetera. So we know all of that already. Secondary socialization happens when we now have to learn how to fit into a smaller, more specialized group of people within that society. So I think Greek life is a really good example here, right? So if you're Rushing, you go through these hazing practices and initiations wherein essentially you learn how to be a member of that group, right? And then once you go through that, you go through that socialization process where maybe you learn some shared language or inside jokes or I don't know. I've never been a part of Greek life, so I'm not going to try and pretend like I know all of this. Um, but you learn all of those more specific things that then allow you to be a part of that smaller group. Okay. So now, having gone through secondary socialization, you now have all the tools to fit into the society at large, and then also this more specific exclusive group. So Greek life is a good example of this. You might even think of joining a particular job, right, where there's rules and you need to dress a certain way and you need to know the hierarchy in your workplace, et cetera, et cetera. So we all go through primary socialization, and now, especially in modern times, we're all going through these different secondary socialization processes too, so we can learn how to fit into these other groups that we're a part of. The other important point here is that socialization is both explicit, right? So sometimes it's very obvious and clear that we're being taught something, and then other times it's a little bit more subtle and it's implicit, okay? So I have these two examples here that I think illustrate this well, right? So in the first example, you have a parent who's telling their child, go wash your hands before dinner, right? They're giving them directions. They might even say, go wash your hands before dinner. It's not polite to come to the table with dirty hands, right? They're explicitly telling them this is the expectation, this is the norm in our society, and maybe even here's why, right? Here's why it's important, it's sanitary, it's blah, 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 blah. Okay. So that's an example of very explicit socialization. In the second example, we have something that's a little bit more subtle, but is still nonetheless teaching and guiding this child about the norms and values of that society, right? So we have Sasha, who's a 5-year-old girl, gets herself ready for school and emerges maybe very proudly in a tiara, a polka dot shirt, and a tutu, okay? Her mom maybe smiles at her, finds this very amusing, this combination of an outfit, and then brings her back into the bedroom and finds another outfit for her. Okay, so in this case, clearly the mom is guiding her in some way and is being directed by some sort of social norm, right? That when we go to school, we dress a certain way, perhaps tutus or just for ballet class, and we don't wear them out of the house or out of the ballet studio, right? In this case, she's not teaching her daughter explicitly how to dress, right? Saying like, oh, well, as good members of the society, we wear this. But she's kind of subtly guiding her daughter, right? Showing her, demonstrating for her that this outfit's unacceptable in some way, and we're going to go back and revise it. Okay, we get these kind of messages all the time. Particularly, we're going to talk a lot about this in regards to gender and also race, right? The implicit socializing messages we get from other people about how we should behave. But the point is here, right, socialization is happening even when we're not aware of it, right? That things are happening that tell us we did the right thing and we were rewarded for that, or maybe we did the wrong thing and we're going to be redirected in some way. Socialization comes from lots of different sources in our lives, right? So in primary socialization, the nuclear family is obviously the most important. Your mom, your dad, maybe even your siblings, right, are always giving you these socializing messages about their expectations for you and how you should be behaving. Young children also get this from teachers a lot. You think of teachers, preschool teachers, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. They're teaching children, but also part of their job is socializing children, essentially watching them and making sure that they behave and, are kind of following the rules of order within the school, right? We're also socialized by our peers, right? So if you think about kids being bullied in the playground, for example, that's a socializing force. It's telling that child that you've done something that is socially inappropriate or is socially shameful in some way, maybe. Our peers also might reinforce us, right, if we do something that's good. And then finally, I threw in here other sources of socialization, and this is probably less true for children, more as you get older, but law enforcement, right? We have people in society whose main job it is to um, give us guidelines, right, or boundaries around what we can and what we can't do. The big point here I want to make, right, is that socialization happens at lots of different levels and in different areas of life, and that's what makes socialization so powerful. If we were only getting these socializing messages from our family, they might not stick as well, right? Because we leave the house and then, we could do whatever we wanted. The fact that we're being socialized by lots of different people in different areas of our lives means it's very strong, right? It's a strong and unified message, and that's why it's really effective at shaping us as we grow up. All right. All right, so then kind of the big question we want to ask here then is, why does socialization matter so much? Why is it important that we go through socialization? And then why is it something we're interested in as sociologists? Why bother studying it at all? So as I've been saying, right, during socialization, we learn these rules and norms in our society. That's really important for creating a cohesive society and also creating a sense of unity between you and other members of that society. So, for example, imagine if you didn't know the basic etiquette or norms in America, right? What that experience would be like, probably how annoyed people would be at you all the time. Similarly, some of you may have visited another country or another culture where you didn't know the basic norms and values, and you might reflect on how out of place you felt, right? So socialization is really important for creating this cohesive society where everyone's kind of on the same page and knows the same rules, okay? And that's really important for the function of society as a whole. The other really important point here is that through socialization, we learn our place in society relative to other people, right? So I think a really good example of this is, as I was saying before, gender socialization. Right? As children, we learn a lot about gender, even if our parents aren't explicitly having conversations with us about it, right? By observing people, by watching TV, seeing how your parents interact, we learn what is gender, number one, right? What genders do we recognize? So did you grow up in a household where men and women were the only genders, or did you grow up in a household where lots of different genders were talked about? Okay. What does it mean to be a certain gender? So if you're a young girl, how are you being raised, right? What are your parents telling you about being a young girl? Are they buying you lots of princess stuff and enrolling you in ballet, right? And maybe they're not saying a lot about gender, but we're still picking up kind of implicit messages about what it means to be a girl or a boy in this world. So on the right here, I have just, one of the many visual examples we have of the toy division between girls and boys, right? That girls have pink, boys have blue, and then also sort of the coded language we use, that girls are beautiful and boys are brilliant. And this is one of the many ways that children get told what their gender means, right? Sort of implicitly, even if we're trying to avoid it, right? And then lastly, I have this quote here from a theorist we're going to talk about in 2 seconds, but he says, one has to be a member of a community to have a self, right? So in order to have a sense of self and a personality, it has to be in relation to other people. It has to be part of a community, right? To be feminine or bold or brilliant, or et cetera, those words only have meaning in relation to other people and what we value, okay? So we're going to start to make the argument today, right, that to have a self is to have a social self, right, and in connection to other people in society. All right. All right, so sort of following on that point, right, part of what we're going to talk about today too is that this learned socialization and what we learn about our place in the world and our community is embodied within us, right? And when we talk about embodiment, it just means something we literally carry in our bodies, right, that we carry around with us. And again, part of what we're going to talk about today is that the social identities we carry around, so our gender, our class, our race, our sexuality, our able-bodiedness, etc., those are learned things through socialization. They're not innate within us. Okay, so our gender does not have meaning, our race does not have meaning, etc., without the context of the broader society, right? So it means nothing for me to be a woman if I don't have a social understanding of gender, right? And we could talk about this in regards to a lot of different categories, and I have some of them listed here. All right, so our social identities are a part of socialization, right? And as the name social identity implies, it has to exist in the context of a broader society. It's not something that we're innately born with. All right, so this is going to bring us to talk about our first theorist for today. This is a guy named George Herbert Mead. He lived from 1863 to 1931. And he was an American sociologist at what we call the Chicago School, which essentially was one of the founding sociological movements in this country. A lot of really famous foundational sociologists came out of there. So he's a part of this big, important sociological movement. And he's interested in what we're going to call the reflexive self. Okay, so Mead, unlike lots of other people, Mead, did I say unlike? Mead, unlike lots of other theorists at the time, has kind of a different understanding of what society is. So he doesn't think that society is just a large group of people or organizations or networks, etc. He thinks it's a set of shared attitudes, okay? So he thinks that having that sense of shared vision about society, same values, same norms, is what defines a society, okay? And he thinks that these attitudes are important because they go on to shape our behavior. So you have a group of individuals who share the same attitudes and then are behaving in similar ways because they all believe in these shared attitudes, okay? Because of this, Mead has a very particular way of understanding the self. Okay, so that sort of inner part of us that we all really kind of hold on to. He doesn't see the self as a personality or a personal identity, but rather a social consciousness that develops as we mature and as we go through socialization. Okay, so what does a social consciousness mean? Essentially, a social consciousness is just an awareness of you in the context of society, right? That you have an awareness of yourself, but you also have an awareness of other people and what they're doing, and as we're going to talk about in a little bit, sort of what they expect from you, right? What their attitudes towards you are. So he makes this argument that the social consciousness develops over time, that we're not born with it, okay? So we're born as babies who are, kind of selfish, narcissistic, right? In the beautiful way that babies are, they're only aware of themselves, right? And so it's as we age that this social consciousness develops. Now, the term he uses to talk about this social consciousness is the reflexive self, okay? So this is his sort of foundational, really important concept that he develops in his life. Okay. So this is going to get a little abstract, so just stay with me for a minute here, and I think it will all make sense over time. All right, so Mead argues that the self has two really critical components to it, and he calls them the I and the me, right? And I know that's going to sound confusing because those are very similar words, but there are some important differences between them. He says that we are all born with a sense of the I, okay? The I, grammatically, right, is a subject, right? So I went to the movies. I is the subject, grammatically speaking, in a sentence, right? That reflects the nature of the I component of the self. This is the component that we're all born with, that those beautifully selfish, narcissistic children all have, right? Which is a sense of self, right? A very strong sense of self, an acknowledgement of what you want and what you need and what your thoughts and opinions are. Okay, we all have that, right? And that's a really important part of being a human being, right? Is having that independence, that individuality, and that very personal perspective in the world and being able to sort of advocate for yourself, right? However, if all of us just had that I, we would all be, as I was saying, right, incredibly narcissistic. We would just be thinking about ourselves. We wouldn't be thinking about other people at any moment. And I don't just mean that in sort of like a philanthropic sense of like we need to consider other people and love other people, right? But that actually as human beings, we're thinking about other people all the time, right? We're thinking about what is this person going to think about the way I'm dressed, or if I don't hand my homework in, what is my teacher going to say? Or what are my parents going to like for Christmas, right? We're always thinking about ourselves in relation to other people. It's impossible not to. So over time, we develop this second component of the reflexive self, which is the me, okay? And again, grammatically, you'll notice that whereas the I is a subject of a sentence, me is an object of a sentence, okay? So I have this comparison down here of two very similar sentences. I went to the movies last night with John versus John took me to the movies last night, okay? So I, again, is a subject here, and me is an object that is acted upon by other people, in this case, by John. Okay, this might still be confusing. Hold on with me for a second. Okay, so in essence, what this me is an awareness of how other people see you, okay? So once we develop this me, no longer are we just thinking about ourselves, but we're also thinking like, well, what do other people think of me? Are other people happy with me? Are they upset with me? Should I behave this way because it's expected of me from other people, right? So suddenly, when we're fully developed, our brains have matured, we're fully socialized, we have these two critical components, right? We're able to think about ourselves as a subject and what we want and how we feel, and we're simultaneously able to reflect on how other people are viewing us at a given time, okay? And it's actually kind of miraculous, right, that we have that capacity for self-reflection. And ultimately, this is what Mead thinks separates us from animals, right? That animals are not able to reflect on their place within a broader group in the same way. And some of you might think, we're like, what about monkeys? Like, what about chimpanzees? And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in that area, but Mead is making the argument that this is really unique to individuals. Okay, so Mead argues that we can see this second component of the reflexive self, the me, develop over time, and that it's really clear if we look at how children play games. And that might sound trivial, but it's actually really important. So Mead says initially when children, very young children, are playing, it's at an imitation level. Okay, they're just sort of watching their mom maybe cook, and sitting at the counter pretending to cook along with them, or watching their dad drive, and playing with the steering wheel, pretending to drive. This kind of gameplay is really simplistic, right? And but it is a first attempt at recognizing other people in the world, right? That this young child who has a very strong I and almost no me, right, is expressing an awareness that there are other people out there doing things and that they might also be imitating them, right? They're taking on the role of other people. So it's not very nuanced, but it is a first attempt at that me sort of saying like, hey, there's other people out there. Like, I wonder what they're doing. Okay. At the second stage, we have what he calls play, right? And during the play stage, we see children start to attempt to learn social rules and take on social roles, right? So, for example, I think a really nice example of this is watching little kids play soccer, right? So I don't know if you guys have younger siblings or maybe children of your own that you've had who are young and you've seen play soccer. It's messy, right? They don't really understand how soccer works, but they do understand that there are teams and that there are objectives, right? So in this young game of soccer, these children are attempting to learn the rules of soccer, right? That they want to score goals, that there's a team they're playing against, right? And they're taking on social roles, that maybe they're a goalie, or they're playing offense or defense, and so they're expected to do certain things by other people, that they have a role within the bigger picture of the team as a whole, right? But again, it's not very nuanced. We see teammates fighting over the ball, we see kids running in different directions, right? There's not that whole developed me, right? There's still a big I, right? They want the ball and they want to control the game, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, we move on to this game stage, and this is where children are really starting to develop that me, right? That awareness of their position in relation to other people. So we have a complex understanding of rules, and at this stage, the child can move in and out of roles at a given time and understands what other people are doing in their roles. Okay, so this is when kids start to be able to play like strategic board games, right? That they understand there's an objective that they're meant to do and that they have a specific role within the game, but that also other people are playing, and they need to be able to anticipate what they're going to do, and then respond to that in order to win. Okay. In essence, as these stages go on and on and on, we see the me start to develop more and more. Okay, so that as children get older, there's an increasing awareness of their position in relation to other people, and also an awareness that other people have feelings about them, right, and what they're doing. Okay, take a sip of coffee. Okay, so ultimately, Mead argues that when we've developed a true, complete social consciousness, we have an understanding of what he calls the generalized other. Okay, so think about the generalized other essentially as a voice in your head that clues you into how other people might think about you, okay, and then how you should shape your own behavior. So we have this quote here from Mead, and he says, "It is in the form of the generalized other that the social process influences the behavior of the individuals involved in it and carrying it on, i.e., that the community exercises control over the conduct of individual members. For it is in this form that the social process or community enters as a determining factor into the individual's thinking." Right? So essentially, what Mead is saying here is that when we're thinking about what we're going to do or what we're going to wear, or just reflecting on past behavior and whether that was right or wrong, there's this kind of abstract voice in our head that represents our community and allows us to kind of think about what other people expect from us and then how they might feel about us. Sorry. Okay, so I think I have two examples here that I think are useful for thinking this through. So the first is the example of a job interview. So I want you all to picture what it's like to prepare for a job interview. Okay, you're probably gonna, as this picture indicates, maybe get a haircut. You're gonna decide what to wear, right? What's gonna look professional? What's gonna, give a good first impression? You're gonna think about what materials to bring with you: a resume, a cover letter, maybe some letters of references, right? You're going to think about your handshake, that you want it to be strong. You're going to think about what questions maybe you're going to ask. You're able to prepare for all of this without actually knowing, in most cases, who's going to be interviewing you and what they're specifically going to be looking for. However, we do have this nice little generalized other voice in our head that we can kind of bounce ideas off of, that I can pull out an outfit from my closet and say, oh, like, is this one going to be good? And then think to myself, like, you know what, maybe that shirt's too low cut for a job interview. Like, people aren't going to be happy with that. Or, you know what, maybe it's too colored. I don't know. It could be lots of various things. But the point is, right, we're able to make those decisions and to anticipate how other people are going to feel about us without actually knowing that person themselves, because we have that abstract voice in our head of our community. This can also go the other way, right? And some of you at this point might be thinking, but like, I don't always conform to what other people expect from me. And that's exactly right, right? Because we have both components of the self, the me and the I, which is tapped into how you feel and what you want, we're able to decide for ourselves. Okay, so in this example here, we have someone who's a part of the punk movement, right? They're rebelling against society and the way they dress and the values that they believe in, et cetera, et cetera. However, in order to rebel, you need to know what the rules of society are, right? When you decide to shave your head into a mohawk or to pierce your ear with a safety pin, you need to know that's going to shock other people and maybe even piss them off a little bit, right? So we can do what we want with that conversation with the generalized other in our head. We can decide to conform, or we can decide to rebel or ignore it. But either way, that voice is still present, and sort of fueling what decisions ultimately we make depending on our overall goal. Okay, so why should we care about this as sociologists? The big point here, right, is that the self is not just our own. Particularly as Americans who really value our independence, we like to think that we have a very unique personality and a sense of self that no one can ever touch but us, right? And that's not completely true, right? Because our sense of self is shaped by these socializing processes. And who we are is very much a product of our particular cultural and historical context. Okay. So we don't just get to decide who we are. I think maybe there's some element to deciding what kind of person you want to be, right? But largely, this is due to the socializing forces that are kind of out of our control. That we are a product of our social environment, and that includes our sense of self and who we are and how we think about the social world. Okay, so we're going to pause on that big dramatic note. And in the next part, we're going to continue this conversation by talking about a specific movement called symbolic interactionism that's going to continue this conversation about micro-sociology a little bit more.